Ancestry is never a clean inheritance. It is a long argument written into the cells, a record of every migration, every alliance, every unrecorded crossing of a river or a sea that one of your forebears made before disappearing into the next chapter. No one carries 100% of any people, anywhere, ever. We are all walking palimpsests, layers of older writing visible beneath the newer ink. But Rome left a chemical signature in the bloodstream of millions, and these are the markers archaeologists and geneticists keep finding. The first sign sits in something most people never think to interrogate: the surname carried at the top of every official document, every birth certificate, every gravestone. Latin gens' names did not vanish when the Western Empire collapsed in 476 CE. They softened. They migrated through medieval Latin charters, through ecclesiastical registers, through the slow drift of vernacular tongues, and they surface today as Fabri, Giuliani, Cornelio, Valeri, Marcelli, Aurelio, even surnames that look French or Iberian on the surface: Julian, Cornelius, Aurelio, Valerio. The mechanism is bureaucratic. A Roman citizen carried 3 names. By law, and after the Edict of Caracalla in 212 CE, extended citizenship to nearly every free inhabitant of the empire. The gene system splintered across 3 continents. Linguists at the University of Bologna have traced specific cognomina from Pompeian graffiti through Visigothic notarial documents into modern Andalusian phone books. A surname is not destiny. But when a family carries a name like Pomponio or Cornelio for 400 documented years in the same Calabrian valley, the probability that some thread of Roman-era lineage threads through that family becomes harder to dismiss than to entertain. Not a guarantee, a residue. Latin pressed into syllables, syllables pressed into church records pressed into the modern self. The name is the oldest fossil most people own. Move to the chromosomes themselves and the signal sharpens. The Y haplogroup, R1-1b, U1152, sometimes called the Italo-Celtic branch, clusters with unusual density across the northern Italian peninsula, the Alpine Arc, southern France, and pockets of Iberia and Britain that overlay almost exactly with the network of Roman military roads. Within the Reich Lab at Harvard and the parallel work coming out of the University of Ferrara, U152 has been dated by ancient samples to a Bronze Age origin, but its spread into Britain and Hispania correlates conspicuously with legionary movement between the 1st century BCE and the 3rd century CE. Then there is J2A M67, common in Anatolia and the Caucasus, carried into the empire by traders, soldiers from the eastern provinces, freedmen of Syrian and Greek origin. EV13, a Balkan-rooted clade, threads through the legions stationed along the Danubian frontier. G2A L497 hugs the Mediterranean coastline like a tide line. A man scrolling through his Y-DNA results and finding any of these, particularly combined with a paternal line traced to former Roman territory, is not staring at proof. He is staring at probability stacked on probability, a pattern the geneticists call enrichment. Cold word for something that feels, when you see it for yourself, like recognition. The autosomal results, the broad mosaic test most people order from consumer ancestry companies, produce a different kind of clue. Anyone of European descent who pulls back a sliver of Italian peninsula ancestry, especially when their documented family tree does not include modern Italy, is looking at a smudge of something older. In 2019, Margaret Antonio and Hannah Moots, working with Ron Pinhasi at the University of Vienna and a Stanford team, published a landmark science paper sequencing 127 ancient individuals from the Rome region spanning 27,000 BCE to 1700 CE. The finding that rippled outward was simple. During the imperial period, the population of Rome was extraordinarily cosmopolitan, drawing genetic input from the eastern Mediterranean, North Africa, the Levant, and Anatolia at levels that modern Italians no longer carry. A Calabrian or Tuscan or Sardinian fingerprint on a modern test can be a relatively narrow geographic signal, but it is also the surviving compression of all those imperial-era arrivals. The footprint shrank. It did not vanish. Sardinian DNA in particular has become a proxy in population genetics for older Neolithic farmer ancestry, and showing. up as a fractional component for someone with no known Italian relatives is, for many, the first hint that something unexpected traveled into the family along an old Roman road. There is a quieter sign hiding in the mitochondrial line. Mitochondrial DNA traces strictly maternal inheritance, and certain haplogroups have a distribution map that overlays Roman trade and settlement geography with surprising fidelity. H1 is broadly European and ancient, but its subclade H1e shows enrichment along the Italian peninsula and the western Mediterranean coast. T2, particularly T2b and T2c, threads through the Aegean, Anatolia, and the Italian south, clades that were already there when Rome was a cluster of huts on the Palatine in 753 BCE, and that the empire then redistributed. J1c carries an imperial-era flavor in its Mediterranean sub-branches. None of these haplogroups says Roman. They say Old Mediterranean, female line, persistent across roughly 2,000 years. A woman in Lyon, or Cadiz, or Bucharest, opening her mitochondrial results and seeing T2b3 listed beside a geographic center near the Tyrrhenian coast is not reading a verdict. She is reading a faint maternal pulse, a great-grandmother of a great-grandmother who, at some unrecorded moment, lived somewhere the empire reached. The chain is long. The chain holds. Geography matters in a way that statistics alone cannot capture. Families whose paper trail dead ends in a former Roman province carry a quiet probability the moment the place name appears. Romania, literally land of the Romans, settled by veterans after Trajan's Dacian wars. In the 2nd century CE, the only Latin-derived language to survive east of the Adriatic. Provence, Provincia, the first Roman territory beyond the Italian peninsula, colonized so thoroughly that its rural Latin is still legible in modern Occitan. Lusitania and Baetica, across the Iberian Peninsula. The Rhone Corridor, the Romanized stretches of Britain south of Hadrian's Wall. North Africa, where the cities of Volubilis and Leptis Magna were once as Roman as any town in Latium. When a family's deepest documented origin is Tarragona, or Trier, or Timisoara, or Tipasa, the imperial mechanism, colonization, veteran settlement, slave importation, imperial bureaucracy moving administrators across thousands of kilometers, has already done much of the genetic work. The Antonio and Moots study captured this from the Roman end. The reciprocal flow is captured in the ancient DNA work emerging from sites across Iberia and Gaul, where post-conquest cemeteries show Eastern Mediterranean and North African signatures appearing precisely when the historical record says soldiers and traders arrived. Geography is not proof. It is the soil where the probability grew. The next sign is linguistic, and it requires careful handling. A family with deep, continuous, rural roots in a region whose native language descends directly from Latin, not Italian or French as national languages, but the older substrate of regional speech, the Calabrese of a village above Cosenza, the Gallego of an inland Galician hamlet, the Aromanian of a Balkan mountain community, the Sardo of a Barbagia herding family, has, on average, slightly higher odds of carrying older Mediterranean autosomal components than a family from the same modern country whose roots lie outside those linguistic enclaves. The reason is not language itself, which carries no genes. The reason is that these enclaves preserved older settlement patterns. Fewer waves of medieval and early modern migration disrupted them, and the populations layered onto Roman-era substrates with relatively little replacement. Linguists working alongside geneticists at the Max Planck Institute have begun pairing dialect maps with genetic samples and finding correlation, not because dialect is destiny, but because both are downstream of the same long stillness. A grandmother whose family has spoken the same hill country Latinate tongue for as long as anyone can remember is a small, living archive. The sound of her voice, the cadence of a market, in a coastal town at dawn, the smell of salt and bread. These are not genetic markers, but they often sit on top of older ones. There is one more sign, and it is the one that catches people most off guard. A Levantine, North African, or Anatolian admixture component appearing on a consumer test in someone of otherwise European descent, especially someone whose tree shows no recent connection to those regions, frequently traces back to Imperial Rome. The 2019 sequencing work made this explicit. During the height of the empire, the proportion of individuals at Rome carrying primarily Eastern Mediterranean ancestry was, by the team's modeling, somewhere near half the sampled population. Slaves, soldiers, merchants, freedmen, administrators, philosophers, physicians. The imperial economy pulled. People across the Mediterranean basin at a scale not matched again until the modern era. When the Western Empire collapsed after 476 CE, the urban populations that had carried the heaviest Eastern signature contracted, and over the medieval centuries, the Italian peninsula's autosomal profile drifted back toward a more European baseline. The signature did not disappear, it diffused. Today, a French family in Marseille pulling 4% Levantine on an ancestry test, with no known relatives outside southern Gaul, is most plausibly looking at the residue of a Roman-era arrival 20 centuries deep. Not a modern crossing. A legionary's wife from Antioch, a freedman from Alexandria, a Syrian merchant who built a villa near Arles and left descendants whose great-great-grandchildren forgot the language but kept the chromosomes. Ancient Rome was already multi-ethnic on a continental scale. The empire was not a people, it was a circulatory system, and what circulated through it left traces in the blood of nearly everyone the system touched. It is worth pausing here for the necessary caution. None of these signs, surname, Y haplogroup, mtDNA clade, autosomal sliver, provincial geography, linguistic enclave, Eastern admixture, is deterministic on its own. Geneticists and historians alike are firm about the limits. A surname can be adopted. A haplogroup can have arrived in your paternal line through routes that bypassed Rome entirely. A consumer test estimates ancestry by comparing to modern reference panels, and modern Italians, as the Stanford and Vienna teams demonstrated, are themselves a downstream population shaped by everything that happened after the empire. The honest reading of any one of these markers is probabilistic. The honest reading of several of them showing up together, in the same family, in the same documented region, is something closer to a thread you can pull. The thread does not lead to togas and laurel wreaths. It leads to ordinary lives. A stonemason from Aquincum, a freedwoman from Capua, an auxiliary from Mauritania, who died at a frontier fort in Britain, whose contributions to your genome were never recorded in any history book. What does it mean then to find yourself in this map? Not that you are Roman in any cultural sense. The empire ended 16 centuries ago, and culture does not transmit through chromosomes. Not that your ancestors were emperors or senators. The overwhelming statistical likelihood is that they were enslaved or poor, or invisible to the chroniclers, which is exactly why their lives survive only in the molecular record. The meaning is quieter than that. Millions of people across Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East walk through their lives unaware that the genetic plumbing they inherited runs through a single imperial system that organized the Mediterranean for half a millennium. Rome left no DNA of its own. There is no Roman gene, but it moved people, and the people moved alleles, and the alleles persisted long after the aqueducts cracked and the basilicas were repurposed into churches. The empire as a piece of architecture is dust. The empire, as a demographic event, is still measurable in living cells. So what would you do with the recognition if it arrived? If a Y haplogroup, or a mitochondrial branch, or a thin slice of Levantine on a consumer test pointed you toward an imperial era arrival, would you let it change anything about the way you see your own face in the mirror? Or would the knowledge sit quietly, the way most ancestral knowledge sits, more a fact than a feeling? Which of the 7 signs do you carry, and would you want to know how deep it goes?